Welcome again to the Medical Terminology Podcast. This episode is Chapter 5, Part 2, Cardiovascular Anatomy. As we talked about in the first part of this chapter, the cardiovascular system is composed of three major parts: the heart, the vessels, and the blood. First of all, let's look at the anatomy of the heart. The technical term for the heart is the myocardium, M-Y-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. This term is composed of the word parts myo, M-Y/O, cardio, C-A-R-D-I/O, and the suffix Put together, this means the muscle, the heart, noun ending. So basically it's the noun that means heart muscle. Surrounding the heart is a sac that is called the pericardium, P-E-R-I-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. If you parse that term, it makes perfect sense. Peri, P-E-R-I hyphen, is a prefix that means around. Cardio, C-A-R-D-I-O, again refers to the heart. And the suffix hyphen U-M means noun ending. So again, we have noun ending surrounding the heart. So that describes the pericardium, which is the sac that surrounds the heart. Now the heart itself actually has three layers to its muscular tissue. First of all, there's the epicardium, E-P-I-C-A-R-D-I-U-M, which is the outer layer. And again, that makes sense because epi would mean above or outer. Then there's the central muscular area, which is the myocardium itself, M-Y-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. And then there's the inner layer, the endocardium, E-N-D-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. And again, by looking at the prefix endo, that means inside or within, that tells us what that term means. So here again, you can see how the word parts really help us. Okay, well that describes the heart muscle itself. Now inside the muscle, there are a lot of parts to the heart that make it work. And it's very difficult to separate what these things are from what they do. In the textbook, there is a diagram that shows you the internal parts of the heart. And we also have a table, 5.1, that describes the process of circulation through the heart, and that explains basically what these different parts do. If you understand what they do, it's much easier to understand how they fit together and what the terms are. Now, before we get into that circulation process and what the parts inside the heart are and what they do, I'm going to skip ahead and talk about blood vessels, because blood vessels are integrated with the heart. We need to know a little bit about the blood vessels. There are three types of blood vessels. The first one is the artery, A-R-T-E-R-Y. And an artery is a blood vessel that carries oxygenated blood. That means it has oxygen in it, oxygenated blood, away from the heart out to the body tissues. Now there's an exception to that I'm going to talk about, but generally speaking, arteries away, think of it that way, arteries away from the heart. Now veins, V-E-I-N-S, do the opposite. Veins carry blood towards the heart. And with one exception, the veins carry deoxygenated blood. That is blood where the oxygen has been used up. Finally, we have the capillaries, which go in between the two. Capillaries, C-A-P-I-L-L-A-R-I-E-S, are very small vessels. They're 1 cell thick, and these allow the exchange of materials between the cells and the blood plasma. It's within the capillaries that oxygen is transported to the tissues, that nutrients are transported to the tissues, and that carbon dioxide and waste products are carried away from the tissues. And at that point where that transfer occurs, the arteries are going into the capillaries, carrying stuff in, and then the transfer occurs, and then when it starts to get carried back to the heart, then we have the veins. The veins start carrying the material, the waste products, back towards the heart. So those are the major vessels: arteries, veins, and capillaries. And now that we have a little understanding of that and what they do, then we can go ahead and look at the circulation of the heart. When blood returns to the heart, it is deoxygenated. That is, it is low in oxygen because it has transferred its oxygen to the tissues in the other parts of the body. When the blood enters the heart, it comes in through two major veins. Remember, veins always carry blood into the heart. We have the superior vena cava right here, and we have the inferior vena cava, also pronounced vena cava. After passing through these two major veins, the blood enters the right atrium. When the atria contract, the blood will move through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. When the ventricles contract, the blood will shoot up through the pulmonary semilunar valve and exit the heart through two arteries. Remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. We have the left pulmonary artery and we have the right pulmonary artery. Pulmonary refers to the lungs, and so these arteries are taking the blood to the lungs. And again, there's a left lung and there's also a right lung. Now in the lungs, the blood will pick up oxygen, and then this blood will become oxygenated, so it turns red. The oxygenated blood will return to the heart through the left pulmonary vein. Again, veins carry blood into the heart, and the right pulmonary vein from the left and right lung, entering the heart in the left atrium. The atria will contract and the blood will pass through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The ventricle will contract and the blood will then leave the heart through the aortic semilunar valve and then enter a very large artery called the aorta. And the aorta will carry blood downward to the lower parts of the body, the abdomen and lower legs, etc. And also it will shoot the blood upward towards the head. Then after the blood has traveled through the body and given the body oxygen, then the whole process will repeat itself again. Now when we look at circulation, there are two major types going on here. First of all, we have the circulation between the heart and the body. If we look at it in a very general way, the blood comes in through the vena cava from the body, and then ultimately it will go out through the aorta to the rest of the body. And this is called the systemic circulation. It's like the main central circulation. But within this process, there is another circulation. And this is the pulmonary circulation. The pulmonary circulation involves the movement of blood from the heart to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries, and then back into the heart through the pulmonary veins. And there's one distinction between these two types of circulation that's kind of important to note. When we're talking about the systemic circulation from the body to the heart and then back to the body, blood coming in is low in oxygen, blood going out is high in oxygen. With pulmonary circulation, it's the exact opposite. The blood going out of the heart is low in oxygen because it's going to the lungs to get oxygen. After it's got the oxygen, the blood coming into the heart is high in oxygen. So it's kind of important to keep those two distinct, primarily because we generally think of the arteries going away from the heart carrying oxygenated blood. The veins going into the heart carry deoxygenated, and that's true for the central circulation. But for the pulmonary circulation, it's the exact opposite. The arteries carry deoxygenated blood, and the veins carry oxygenated blood. Okay, we've covered quite a few terms at this point, so now it's time to do some practice and review. What is the term for the heart muscle? That's the myocardium. M-Y-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. What is the term for the vessel that carries blood away from the heart? That's the artery. A-R-T-E-R-Y. What is the term for the sac that surrounds the heart? That's the pericardium. P-E-R-I-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. What is the term for the vessel that carries blood towards the heart? That's a vein. V-E-I-N. And do you remember the word part for vein? Well, that's plebo. P-H-L-E-B/O. What is the term for a vessel that is only one cell thick, which allows plasma to exchange materials between cells? That's a capillary. C-A-P-I-L-L-A-R-Y. And what is the term for the innermost layer of heart muscle? That's the endocardium. E-N-D-O-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. And what is the term for the outer layer of heart muscle? That's the epicardium. E-P-I-C-A-R-D-I-U-M. What is the term for the circulation that occurs between the heart and the lungs? Well, that's the pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary, circulation, circulation. And so, what is the term for the circulation that occurs between the heart and the rest of the body? That's the systemic circulation. Systemic. Okay, and now we're going to look at the circulation itself. What is the name for the vessels that carry blood into the heart? Well, that's the vena cava. Venacava. And remember, there's two of them. Do you remember the terms for the two vena cava? Well, there's the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. What is the term for the very large artery that carries the oxygenated blood away from the heart to the rest of the body? Well, that's the aorta. Aorta. What is the term for the chamber of the heart that first receives blood from the body through the vena cava? That's the right atrium. Right, Right, atrium, Atrium. What is the term for the vessel that carries blood from the heart to the lungs? Well, that's the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary, Pulmonary, artery, Artery. What is the term for the chamber of the heart that pumps blood into the pulmonary artery so that it can go to the lungs? Well, that's the right ventricle. Rightventricle. And what is the term for the vessel that carries oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart? That's the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary, veins, Veins. What is the term for the fourth chamber of the heart? It's the last one in the sequence that pumps blood out of the heart into the aorta so that it can go back to the rest of the body. That's the left ventricle. Left ventricle. Ventricle. And what is the term for the valve that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle? That's the mitral valve, M-I-T-R-A-L. And what is the term for the valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle? That's the tricuspid valve, T-R-I-C-U-S-P-I-D. What is the term for the valve that separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary arteries? Well, that's the pulmonary semilunar valve. Pulmonary, semilunar, semilunar. And what is the term for the valve that separates the aorta from the left ventricle? Well, that's the aortic semilunar valve. Aortic, A-O-R-T-I-C, semilunar, S-E-M-I-L-U-N-A-R. Okay, well, that gets us through the anatomy of the vessels and the heart and some knowledge of the circulatory process. Now, the last part of the cardiovascular system is the blood. Our textbook has a pretty nice map in it that shows the different parts of the blood, and I'm going to review that with you and just try to add a couple of extra pointers to it. First of all, blood has two major components, the plasma and the formed elements. Plasma is fluid, primarily water, that also has some nutrients, hormones, and waste products dissolved in it. And in addition to these hormones, nutrients, and waste products, there are also some proteins. The formed elements are the blood cells, which many of us have heard of. And there are three types of blood cells. The first type is the thrombocyte, Thrombocyte. Now, based on its word parts, can you figure out what a thrombocyte is? Well, I hope you remember thrombo means clot. So a thrombocyte is a clotting blood cell. It's responsible for helping the blood to clot. The second type of blood cell is the erythrocyte, Erythrocyte. And based on its word parts, what is the common name for an erythrocyte? Well, that's a red blood cell. And red blood cells contain a compound called hemoglobin, Hemoglobin. And hemoglobin has the property of being able to easily attach to oxygen. And so hemoglobin is the compound that carries the oxygen through the blood system. And finally, we have the leukocytes, Leukocytes. And based on its word parts, what is the common name for a leukocyte? Well, a leukocyte is a white blood cell, and the white blood cells are responsible for the immune response. They help protect us against a variety of diseases. There's two major groups, the ones that end in phil, Phil, and the ones that end in cyte, Cyte. And if you refer to the text itself, it points out that the ones that end in "phil" are produced by the bone marrow. The ones that end in "cyte," the lymphocytes and monocytes, are produced in the bone marrow, but then they also go off to the lymph nodes and the spleen, where they can do some further development. And then they just give us a few facts about these different leukocytes. If we go through the phils first, it tells us that the neutrophil, Neutrophil, is the most common white blood cell, and it has the ability to eat pathogens, and a pathogen is a disease-causing organism. The basophil, Basophil, is the least common white blood cell, and it is responsible for some allergic reactions. And finally, we have the eosinophil, which is also the hardest one to pronounce. Eosinophil. And the eosinophil has the ability to destroy parasites, and also it is responsible for some allergy reactions. Now, the other two that end in "cyte" are the lymphocyte, Lymphocyte, and the lymphocyte is really the bad boy of the immune system here. The lymphocyte has the ability to produce antibodies that can go on and destroy a variety of pathogens. And it does this by being able to recognize something that has already attacked the body. When something's attacked the body, the lymphocytes go into action and make antibodies to them. And then if that same disease tries to attack again, the antibodies are able to easily isolate and stop the pathogen before it can start any trouble. And then finally, there are the monocytes, Monocytes. And the monocytes, like the neutrophil, have the ability to eat infectious organisms. So those are the formed elements. Now looking back at the plasma can be further divided into two parts, the serum and the proteins. The serum is all the fluid with nutrients, hormones, waste products. And then the proteins are the clotting proteins that also help the blood to clot. And there's two of those, prothrombin, Prothrombin, and fibrinogen, Fibrinogen. And both of those help the blood to clot. Okay, well now let's do some practice over the blood. What are the formed elements? Well, the formed elements are the blood cells. And which type of blood cell is responsible for the clotting of blood? Well, that's the thrombocyte, Thrombocyte. And which type of blood cell is responsible for immune reactions and immune defense? Well, that's the leukocyte, commonly known as the white blood cell, Leukocyte. And which formed element is responsible for carrying oxygen? Well, that's the red blood cell, formerly known as the erythrocyte, Erythrocyte. And what is the compound in an erythrocyte that enables it to carry oxygen? Well, that's hemoglobin. hemoglobin. What is the term for the straw-colored fluid that composes more than half of the blood volume? Well, that's plasma. Plasma. What is the term for the component of plasma that is primarily fluid without the clotting proteins? Well, that's the serum. Serum. What is the term for the type of leukocyte that can produce antibodies against a variety of diseases? Well, that's the lymphocyte. Lymphocytes. And what is the term for the leukocyte that is the most common leukocyte? It also has the ability to eat pathogens. Well, that's the neutrophil. Neutrophil. And what is the term for the type of leukocyte that has the ability to destroy parasites and also it causes allergic reactions? Well, that's the eosinophil. Eosinophil. What are the names of the two clotting proteins that are included in the blood plasma? Well, that's prothrombin, prothrombin, and also fibrinogen, fibrinogen. And what is the term for the least common white blood cell that is responsible for allergic reactions? Well, that's the basophil. Basophil. And finally, what is the term for the leukocyte that can eat infectious organisms that's formed in the bone marrow, but also can be given extra development in the lymph nodes and spleen? Well, that's the monocyte. Monocyte. Well, there has been a lot of material here so far, just in the anatomy. In the next episode, we'll go on and we'll look at the pathologies. This ends this episode of the Medical Terminology Podcast.